It is between the years 630 and 570 BCE, and the island of Lesbos is inhabited by one Sappho. Though her sexuality is debated, she is regarded as a symbol for love between women. A sentence from an essay by Alistair Blanchard for theconversation.com reads, "Every time that the legal rights of gays and lesbians have been discussed, somebody will evoke the Greeks. This ancient civilization is often looked back on wistfully for its attitudes towards same-sex love. But of course, their views were much more complex and erroneous in some aspects. Male same-sex relationships attracted more care and interest in the Greek world than those of women. This attentiveness is exemplified in the ritual of courtship between older and adolescent men, as well as the myths created detailing gay relationships, such as the one between Hyacinthus, Apollo, and Zephyrus. Very little is known about the lives of same-sex attracted women in ancient Greece, and in Sappho's case, work exploring love between women was actively suppressed, either by destroying them or heterosexualizing them. Sappho wrote a total 10,000 lines of poetry, but only 650 have survived. Her poems are often melancholic due to unrequited love or true love being impeded through forced marriage. Regarding style, her work is characterized by simple thoughts, clear language, and a decorative use of hyperbole. Her pieces explore individual identity and emotions such as desire, jealousy, and love in a way that mirrors the supernatural and grandiose narratives of epic poetry. Let us have a look at one of her pieces, titled Ode to Aphrodite. It reads, "Aphrodite, subtle of soul and deathless, daughter of God, weaver of wiles, I pray thee, neither with care, dread mistress, nor with anguish, slay thou my spirit. But in pity hasten, come now, if ever, from afar of old when my voice implored thee. Thou hast deigned to listen, leaving the golden house of thy father. With thy chariot yoked, with doves that drew thee, fair and fleet around the dark earth from heaven, dipping vibrant wings down the azure distance, through the mid-ether. Very swift they came in thou gracious vision, leaned with face that smiled in immortal beauty, leaned to me and asked, what misfortune threatened, why I had called thee? What my frenzied heart craved in utter yearning, whom its wild desire would persuade to passion? What disdainful charms madly worshipped slight thee? Who wrongs thee, Sappho? She that fain would fly, she shall quickly follow. She that now rejects, yet with gifts shall woo thee. She that heeds thee not, soon shall love to madness, love thee, the loth one. Come to me now, thus goddess, and release me from distress and pain, and all my distracted heart would seek, do thou once again fulfilling. Still be my ally." This poem was written in Aeolic Greek, which is a Lesbian dialect. Lesbian is in the demonym of a person from Lesbos. If you'd like some insight on the intricacies of the dialect, a link is provided. Structure-wise, the poem comprises Sapphic stanzas, which are 3 identically long lines, followed by a shorter 4th line. The ode is a prayer to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, from a speaker who longs for the affections of an unnamed woman. How do we know the speaker is Sappho? Well, she names herself in the line, "Who wrongs thee, Sappho?" a question asked to her by Aphrodite. We can confirm that the unnamed person is a woman because the line, "Love thee, the loth one," is written in Aeolic Greek as koik ethelisa. Ethelisa is the feminine word for volunteer. In context of the stanza, Sappho asks the goddess to ease the pains of her unrequited love for this woman, after being appealed to, Aphrodite appears to Sappho to tell her that the woman who has rejected her advances will in time pursue her or volunteer herself to her, as a direct translation. Quote, "She that heeds thee not, soon shall love to madness, love thee, the loth one." The poem concludes with another call for the goddess to assist the speaker in all her amorous struggles. The poem, along with the lyrics of Sappho 31, are pieces that prove that Sappho loved other women. Some have analyzed that the piece was performative and intended for Sappho's audience of female friends, or possibly a parody of a Homeric epic. Regardless of which way the interpretation sways, I think this passage from a Wikipedia entry can bring us to a different conversation. Quote, "Today it is generally accepted that Sappho's poetry portrays homoerotic feelings. As Sandra Boehringer puts it, her work clearly celebrates eros between women. Towards the end of the 20th century, though, some scholars began to reject the question of whether or not Sappho was a lesbian. Glenn Most wrote that Sappho herself would have had no idea what people meant when they would call her nowadays a homosexual. Audre Lorde stated that it is nonsensical to ask whether Sappho was a lesbian, and Paige Dubois calls the question a particularly obfuscating debate. Interesting that being attracted to the same sex did not bear our modern meaning or possibly any meaning at all during her time. The heterosexualization of her work only happened in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, long after her death, and it seems that it was done because she was a woman and her being a lesbian wasn't as valid as the homosexual relationships between men. Of course, over time, being a lesbian would gain all sorts of meaning, a good portion of which was totally groundless and mostly reactionary. The third wave of feminism gives us a closer look at the works of modern lesbian feminists and how they explored and even recharted the ideological constructs of gender and sexuality. Along with the conversation of lesbianism was the race factor that seemed to be a thorn in the flesh of the feminist movement. What was feminism to the woman of color? More so, the lesbian or queer woman of color.
Well, the legendary poet, essayist, and feminist Adrienne Rich died on Tuesday at the age of 82. Rich was one of the most celebrated poets of the last half-century and a lifelong advocate for women, gay and lesbian rights, peace, and racial justice. Rich drew widespread acclaim for her many volumes of poetry and prose, which brought the oppression of women and lesbians into the public spotlight. She was a key figure in the women's movement and an uncompromising critic of the powerful. Rich won numerous awards and honors, including the National Book Award for the 1973 collection, Diving into the Wreck. Refusing to accept the award alone, she appeared on stage with poets Audre Lorde and Alice Walker, and the three accepted the award on behalf of all women.
We knew we were outsiders. We knew we were outside the pale. We lived in the village. We were outsiders. We were dykes, right? A lot of us were artists. We hated typing, right? We didn't want straight jobs. Whatever we did, we were at the fringe. Now, this, of course, was the 50s. It was like the gay girls' version of the beatniks. You have to remember that the lesbian gay girls, because that's what we would call the gay girls population, was a reflection of what else was going on, right, around us. And that was the era of, let's pretend this is the best of all possible worlds. This is exactly what we choose, right? And this is it. So, like, nobody talked about racism.
Right. So if something happened to me in a bar, I couldn't count on anybody standing up and covering my back. A white lesbian would not stand up to cover my back. They may say, personally, oh, isn't that too bad it happened to you? But not, hey, this shouldn't happen, period.
We know that the second wave brought much success at institutional levels, and women had more rights and power going into the 90s. This liberty allowed the conversation to broaden and foster more individuality and non-conformity. Adding to that, this was a time where the internet became more commonplace, so many movements broke out and could be introduced to people all over the world. The term third wave feminism was coined by Rebecca Walker in an article titled Becoming the Third Wave for Ms. Magazine, wherein she proclaims, "I am the third wave." She was 23 at the time and is a bisexual woman of color who helped raise consciousness over race in the feminist movement. This introduced the aforementioned term intersectionality, which is a framework for understanding the complex ways that many aspects of people's identities overlap, namely their race, gender, sexual orientation, class, and more. Intersectionality realizes that some women face more injustice or oppression because of how their other identities intersect with their womanhood. The eminence of intersectionality within feminism caused the term woman poet to be resisted, thus creating a distinction between women poets and feminist poets. Woman poet implied confining to a collective identity, which certainly wasn't the case in the third wave, where women actively expressed their individuality in how they spoke and dressed. Take Riot Girl, for example. It is an underground feminist punk movement that is still a strong subculture in our present day. Feminist poets found themselves increasingly opposed to the poetry establishment, and the reason why is expressed in the following passage from the book The Feminist Poetry Movement by Kim Whitehead. Quote, "In most ways, these two worlds, the mainstream and the feminist, still do not intersect, but remain parallel and contradictory. The case of the Pratt Award ceremony clearly illustrates that feminist poets are indeed engaged in an ongoing struggle with the guardians of the contemporary poetry establishment. They are censored or rejected because they self-consciously call on distinctly feminist poetics, and most especially if they write explicitly about their personal experiences of not only gender, but other differences. In Pratt's case, lesbianism, but also race, ethnicity, and class." End quote. So feminist poets, unlike woman poets, strived to bring light to oppression beyond gender. Now let's talk about Minnie Bruce Pratt, the woman mentioned in the quote. She was born September 12, 1946, in Alabama, to a social worker, Mrs. Pratt, and a clerk, Mr. Pratt. She attended a segregated high school and graduated from the University of Alabama with her bachelor's in 1968. During her time at university, she married fellow poet Marvin E. Weaver II, with whom she had 2 sons. Pratt had stopped writing after her marriage, but she returned to poetry in 1975 after she came out as a lesbian. In her own words, quote, "I returned to poetry, not because I had become a lesbian, but because I had returned to my body after years of alienation." After finding out about her sexual orientation, her ex-husband threatened her with complete loss of rights to her sons if she did not follow his wishes to have primary custody. He was enabled by the state's Crime Against Nature statute, which criminalized homosexual activity. This is an experience that she explores in depth in her poetry. Her first volume of poetry, titled Crime Against Nature, named after the statute, explores her struggle to maintain her relationship with her sons, as her time with them was often abrupt and the conditions under which she could develop their relationship were often stringent. Her ex-husband wouldn't even allow the children to visit her new home, and in a poem titled The Place Lost and Gone, The Place Found, she details that on weekend visits she and her sons would travel back and forth over the borders of creeks and rivers between the remnants of their former stable life and an uncertain future. While lecturing at Fayetteville State University, she joined a feminist writing collective where she produced a feminary journal that earned her a PhD in English literature. Throughout the 80s, she taught at various universities, and from 2003 till 2015, she was a professor of women's and gender studies and writing and rhetoric at Syracuse University in New York, where she developed the university's first LGBT study program. She met her spouse, transgender lesbian activist and writer Leslie Feinberg, in 1992. The couple married in 2011. Sadly, Feinberg died in 2014. I couldn't get my hands on any of her books, so I'm not sure where the following poem is from. Nevertheless, I am reading Aura by Minnie Pratt. My grandmother is dying. She writhes and yells as they bathe her. She said that she never felt like anyone until she married. She was such a lady. She would be embarrassed to see herself now. I saw her wedding yesterday from behind a fence of cardboard placards. I wore blue jeans, the crowd wore fur, and she was swathed in veils of ivory illusion. They aimed a machine gun at us from the steeple and cheered. As she edged past into the house on the arm of the president, we were chanting for justice, for U.S. prisoners, when the words rolled into her name. Aura, heart of gold, you let down your silver hair for us to comb and grasp. You wound it into braids for your crown. Your arthritic hands crackled as you combed the wool and pierced our comforts. Your head is shorn now, but I never thought you would die. The seam that you have sewn stretches even and fine. I enjoyed reading that, but I must be honest, I only know what's going on for a quarter of the poem. So here are my crumbs. I found a transcript of an interview Pratt did, and in it she talks about her family and career in general. Her maternal grandmother's name was Aura, the title of the poem, and she lived between the late 19th century and early 20th century. I mention this because when looking for a definition of the word aura, it was a popular name around that time. However, another definition of the word is an opening or entrance to a passage, either a mouth or the end of the cervix. Now, looking at the first stanza, lines 5 to 6 read, "She said that she never felt like anyone until she married." These lines insinuate the idea that marriage could give a woman value, but that belief is expected of her grandmother as she was from a time when that was a popular opinion. In analyzing the line following after, which reads, "She was such a lady," I referred to the interview where Pratt said the following about her grandmother and mother. Quote, "Well, what was kind of interesting about my mother's side of the family was that all of the stuff about being a lady was really from the outside. The women in my family were not ladies in that way. And I learned from those women to work really, really hard. My grandmother knew how to work as someone who had grown up on a farm, so she knew how to make things. Everything. Soap, cod wool for comfort, I mean, you name it, she knew how to make it. She was from that generation where you made everything." End quote. So, I think it's reasonable to conclude that when Pratt refers to her grandmother's demeanor as a lady, she doesn't mean it in the classical sense that she was dainty and refined. Following that, she describes her writhing and yelling as she's being bathed, which could mean that she was used to being independent and doing things for herself. So being bathed by others and furthermore subduing herself to marriage would be an embarrassment to her character. In the second stanza, we have a change in scenery. The wedding becomes a symbol for something else. The speaker, who we've presumed is Minnie, describes the wedding from behind a fence of cardboard placards, which indicates that this wedding is actually a protest. Her grandmother is covered up completely and has the president on her arm as she makes her way into the church, and people with machine guns are ready to fire from the church steeple. That is a lot, and I don't know what to make of it. Despite that, Pratt is still heavily involved in social causes to this day. There are various images of her at protests, rallying for change. So she wrote this from experience. I speculate that her grandmother in this poem is a symbol for the feminist movement, and this poem maybe narrates the achievements of the movement at that time, ending with the lines, "The seam you have sown stretches even and fine," which could refer to the legacy of the second wave carrying over into the third wave. Our next poet is Chrystos. Chrystos is a Menominee writer and two-spirit activist. Their work delineates the civil rights of indigenous Americans and how colonialism, genocide, gender, and class affect women and indigenous people's lives. Their work is primarily intended to raise awareness of Native American heritage and culture, which leads us to explore their two-spirit identity. Two-spirit is an umbrella term that includes a multitude of cultural beliefs and traditions. The term has been present in Native American communities long before the conception of Western LGBTQ terminology. Two-spirit is a spiritual journey that comprises gender and sexual identity. Two-spirit people have both a male and female spirit within them and are blessed by their creator to see life through the eyes of both genders. In many tribes, they are the balance keepers and play an integral role in the sacred hoop, which is a symbol signifying the Earth's boundary and all the knowledge of the universe. Along with their Native American audience, Chrystos directed their pieces to people of color and lesbians, and the poem I will be reading details the struggle of being a lesbian, and by extension, the struggle of not conforming to traditional or Western gender and sexual norms. The piece is titled Crooning. It reads, "A soft old song for every lesbian who wants to go home again and can't, with her woman lover in her arms, holding hands in the streets, simple in our love, that they twist, so no lies, not cousins, not best friends, not roommates, no second bedrooms for show, no pretend boyfriends, no custody cases, no hidden mouths, no grim smiles at queer jokes on the job you'd lose if they knew. Go home with joy and strength. Go home, be received instead of tolerated. No anguished mothers afraid of father's response, or neighbor's gossip, or grandma's heart condition. Go home to a clean, welcome mat, a double bed, no questions, accusations, or expectations. I croon an old soft song for us, rocking down to a kind place we won't see in our lives, fighting for it even when we're drunk in bars because we can't go home. Crooning for us, my heart split." What a great piece. Chrystos so passionately relays the desires of those in lesbian relationships who cannot openly express their sexuality. Crooning, this piece is softly sung for all the lesbians who can't love as they'd like to, who can't go about having a relationship without the anguish of their mothers or the fear of their father's reactions. The lesbians who have to strive their way through flagrant opposition, exemplified in legislation, and even the most subtle slight, like queer jokes and gossip. I think this song rings true and really shows that while the feminist movement was making all its progress, the empowerment of minorities would be worlds apart. I think the best person to describe this distance is Audre Lorde, who is our next poet. At the start of the chapter, I played a news segment and then another clip followed. That was Audre Lorde herself, describing what it was like to be a black lesbian feminist. As she said, a lot of them were artists, and she was a prolific one at that. Audre Lorde was an American writer, feminist, womanist, librarian, and civil rights activist. She dedicated her life and work to addressing racial injustice, sexism, and homophobia. As a poet, she is widely acclaimed for her technical mastery and emotional expression. I couldn't find her recital for the poem we will discuss, but there are plenty of interviews and recitals out there for you to relish her cadence and vocal nuances. She was born in New York to Caribbean immigrant parents. Her father, Byron Lorde, was Barbadian and bore a darker complexion than his wife, Linda Belmar Lorde, who was Grenadian but passed for Spanish. Her mixed ancestry and ability to racially pass was a source of pride for the Belmar family, who, with a semblance of reluctance, eventually allowed for her marriage to Mr. Lorde because his charisma and persistence overshadowed his complexion. Growing up, Lorde had a difficult relationship with her parents. She barely spent time with either one of them, as they would be busy maintaining their real estate business amid the waning economy of the Great Depression. When she did interact with them, they were often cold and distant. Her mother, in particular, is said to have been suspicious of people with skin darker than hers. Trust me, I'm trying to make sense of that myself, which Audre had. This, in combination with her wariness of the outside world, was the cause for Audre's strict upbringing. Poetry became a powerful means of expression for Lorde. She recounts that she would think in poetry and memorized various poems that she would recite when she communicated with others. She would often refer to herself as crazy and queer to give reason as to why she had been outcasted so much in her youth. What seemed to others as a phase of hers turned out to be a transfiguration into her true form, a continuum of women and a concert of women is what she'd say of herself as her influence blossomed. She was steadfast on confronting issues of racism and feminist thought, which often led to angry confrontation from white feminists, who she considered to augment the oppression of black women. This fervent disagreement with notable white feminists furthered Lorde's persona as an outsider. There is much to be said about her travels, essays, speeches, and interviews, but for now I shall say that Lorde's contributions are as relevant now as they were in their inception. Despite her succumbing to cancer at age 58, her words have proved themselves timeless. I am reading you Who Said It Was Simple by Audre Lorde. There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Sitting in Nedicks, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes, a waiting brother to serve them first, and the ladies neither notice nor reject the slighter pleasures of their slavery. But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations. There are indeed so many roots to the tree of anger, namely racism and homophobia. Lorde took note of a hierarchy in the feminist movement. On one hand, you had white feminists who often identified with their white brothers more than the problematic girls, that is, women like her. And she makes it a point to say that what characterizes these problematic girls isn't the fact that they're outspoken, but because they happen to be the wrong race or have the wrong sexuality. Hence, Lorde says that she is bound by her mirror and bed, that is, her skin color as well as her sexual orientation. These are two innate and immutable parts of herself that she wonders which will survive the liberation of other less oppressed groups, meaning that the liberation of her identities isn't even on the table. So women like her remain as the girls, quote, hired to make them free, them being the white feminists. Ultimately, Lorde uses this poem to emphasize that all social justice movements must be rooted in a foundation of intersectionality in order to be genuine and effective. Women of color in the First World wanted a differentiated feminism. However, this would come at the expense of women in developing nations who began to have a seat at the table. Feminist scholars called for a feminist politics of location, which theorized that women were subject to specific assemblies of oppression, and therefore all women emerged with particular identities rather than a generic one. While they encouraged a global community of women, Lorde in particular felt the cultural homogenization of Third World women could only lead to a disguised form of oppression, with its own forms of othering towards women in developing nations. This would repeat the cycle of an oppressed group using one of its own as a means to an end. Let's focus in on the globalization of feminism and have a look at how feminist dogma made its way around the world. European and American feminists had begun to interact with the emergent feminist movements of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. As this happened, the women in developed countries were often horrified to discover that women in some countries were required to wear veils in public or to endure forced marriage, female infanticide, widow burning, or female genital cutting, FGC. Many Western feminists quickly assumed themselves to be saviors of Third World women, without realizing that their perceptions of and solutions to social problems were often at odds with the real lives and concerns of women in these regions. In many parts of Africa, the status of women had only begun to erode significantly with the arrival of European colonialism. In those regions at that time, the notion that the patriarchy was the chief problem was absurd because European imperialism was a greater culprit. The conflicts between women in developed and developing nations played out most vividly at international conferences throughout the 80s and 90s. At a UN conference in 1980, women from less developed nations complained that the veil and FGC had been chosen as conference priorities without consulting the women most concerned. It seemed that their counterparts in the West were just not listening to them. In 1994, women from the Third World protested outside a conference on population and development because they believed the agenda had been hijacked by Europeans and Americans. The protesters had expected to talk about ways that underdevelopment was holding women back. Instead, conference organizers chose to focus on contraception and abortion. Aziza Al-Hibri is a law professor and scholar of Muslim women's rights. She is quoted as saying, Third World women noted that they could not very well worry about other matters when their children were dying from thirst, hunger, or war. The conference instead centered around reducing the number of Third World babies in order to preserve the Earth's resources, despite the fact that the First World consumes much of these resources. So, it's safe to say that feminism got a little more complicated following its global crusade. Cue the fourth wave.
The late Kenyan Nobel Peace Laureate Wangari Maathai put it simply and well when she said, "The higher you go, the fewer women there are."
I think the most dangerous conception, especially for my generation, is that the feminist movement has been waged and we won and we are totally and completely equal. So you have young women who are being told you can do everything, you're completely equal, go for your dreams, and then when they get out into the real world and they face sexism and discrimination blatantly, but oftentimes not blatantly, they think that something is wrong with them instead of something still being wrong with the world.
I don't remember what this particular argument was about, but I remember that as I argued and argued, Okoloma looked at me and said, "You know, you're a feminist." It was not a compliment. I could tell from his tone, the same tone that you would use to say something like, "You're a supporter of terrorism." He told me that people were saying that my novel was feminist, and his advice to me and he was shaking his head sadly as he spoke, was that I should never call myself a feminist because feminists are women who are unhappy because they cannot find husbands. So I decided to call myself a happy feminist.
For me, personally, feminism is hearing your pain and your struggle in another woman's voice and suddenly realizing there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with her, but there's something wrong with the world that's trying to make you think that there is, and together you're better equipped to fight it.
A Nigerian acquaintance once asked me if I was worried that men would be intimidated by me. I was not worried at all. In fact, it had not occurred to me to be worried because a man who would be intimidated by me is exactly the kind of man I would have no interest in.
Fourth wave feminism continues to reckon with intersectionality. There is still criticism of, quote, white feminism. However, transgender rights have become a big part of the conversation. As we've just discussed, feminism hasn't always been the most welcoming movement for transgender women and those who reject the gender binary. Having said that, many fourth wave feminists are working to combat this exclusion. And we have an example of such efforts in the matriarch of Insta poetry herself, Rupi Kaur. On page 162 in her latest book, Homebody, she writes, "I am not interested in a feminism that excludes trans women. That ought to tell the TERFs." The fourth wave is seemingly more radical than its predecessors. It has emerged from the chambers of institutions and rhetoric of academics to the realm of public discourse. Issues that were central to the earliest phases of the women's movement are now receiving national and international attention through mainstream and social media. The issues include sexual abuse and assault, violence against women, the defense of reproductive rights, unequal pay, slut-shaming, the pressure on women to conform to unrealistic beauty standards. I'll also throw in the emergence of environmental feminists and the realization that female representation in politics and business are still very slight. This revisionist view of feminism has been perceived as partisan, and so it has got to the point where there is a stigma of sorts in identifying as a feminist. This isn't to say that there has never been a stigma in identifying as one, but there are more people strongly identifying with its tenets, which is making a whole lot of cultural change, shaking the foundations of society, if you will. In reaction, this often causes feminism to be the scapegoat of many current issues, such as declining marriage rates, birth rates, increased mental illness, and the growing rift between the sexes. I'd argue that these issues are more prevalent in the developed world. However, due to globalization, it's easier for people in developing nations to take sides over feminism, either seeing it as an usherer of social instability or a force necessary to be on par with the developed world. When I think of fourth wave poetry, Insta poetry instantly comes to mind. It can be activistic, it's meant to uplift and can validate anyone because there are pieces out there for all sorts of readers, and fourth wave feminism is definitely all about inclusion. And of course, how can we talk about Insta poetry without mentioning Rupi Kaur? I know this is the second time I'm mentioning her, but feminism is a prevalent theme in her work, and one of her most popular feminist pieces is from her debut book, Milk and Honey. It doesn't have a title, so I'll just read it. "I want to apologize to all the women I have called pretty before I've called them intelligent or brave. I am sorry I made it sound as though something as simple as what you're born with is the most you have to be proud of, when your spirit has crushed mountains. From now on, I will say things like, you are resilient or you are extraordinary, not because I don't think you're pretty, but because you are so much more than that." This piece is a good reminder to women, and really anyone, in an age of social media that their worth is beyond their physical attributes. Because we are able to put ourselves on display a lot more, our appearances can become an unhealthy source of pride or insecurity over the things that really matter, which are personality and character. I get a similar message from a piece by Nikita Gill, another poet on Instagram. This one's titled, "Don't Be Beautiful." I'm sure you've come across this poem at some point. It reads, "They keep saying that beautiful is something a girl needs to be, but honestly, forget that. Don't be beautiful. Be angry, be intelligent, be witty, be klutzy, be interesting, be funny, be adventurous, be crazy, be talented. There are an eternity of other things to be other than beautiful. And what is beautiful anyway, but a set of letters strung together to make a word? Be your own definition of amazing, always. That is so much more important than anything beautiful ever." So here we have moved from being more than your looks to practically leaving beauty on the wayside to explore attributes other than being beautiful. Being beautiful, according to the speaker, is a social construct to be done away with. As she says, "And what is beautiful anyway but a set of letters strung together to make a word?" And while I understand and appreciate where the speaker is coming from, I feel as though the message is conflicting in some ways, because it seems as though wanting to be beautiful cannot coexist with being klutzy, talented, amazing, or angry, which are different attributes among themselves. Klutziness is a more individual thing than being talented, amazing, or angry. The latter three are general terms and aren't really unique. And being amazing or angry isn't really like a unique thing. But I understand that women and girls are discouraged from showing or possessing these traits in one way or another. And this poem seeks to normalize these traits and champion individuality. Now we're changing the tone. I think the poems we've just discussed fall short in their ability to communicate a lasting message. I'm not saying that the poetry from the fourth wave is all insta poetry, but rather that they seemed to emerge at the same time. And so this style of simple and unstructured pieces has become a popular mode to sound off the present feminist rhetoric. While there is some good in that these ideas can be readily accessed and engaged with, there is greater room for misinformation, the formation of echo chambers, and even losing sight of what the feminist cause is about. Our next poem is by Tamil poet Sharanya Manivannan. She gives a very profound view of womanhood outside Western discourse. The piece I will be reading is titled "The Mothers." It reads, "A mother wearing glass beads, looking for another handkerchief, the melted candy in the one she is carrying, as sticky as the nose being wiped on her arm, under church fans too slow for this April heat. A mother whose only existing photograph of him was borrowed permanently by someone who told her they could be trusted with her story, praying to the saint who restores what has been lost, on her knees again, as many times as it will take. A mother whose own countenance howls in frames the world scrolls past, captured by someone who did not care to learn her name or the names of her dead. A mother who is Amma, her other name forgotten, the word a scream in the room at the morgue, where bodies beloved are identified by wedding rings and blood-splashed shoes on a projection screen. A mother who wishes they could have gone for a swim first, but they are so hungry she has to stand between them in the buffet line so they don't break into a fight. A mother with a baby keeping time inside her body. A mother with a bomb. A mother in the kitchen measuring the sugar generously, preparing the Easter's feast, waiting for the little ones who must just now be saying grace in a circle at Sunday school, waiting for the little ones to come home. On April 21st, 2019, Sri Lanka was rocked by a series of deadly blasts, which would later be known as the Easter Sunday bombings. As many as 8 blasts occurred in and around the capital Colombo, as large groups gathered at churches for Easter. St. Anthony's Shrine, St. Sebastian's Church, and Zion Church, as well as 3 luxury hotels in the commercial capital, were targeted in a series of coordinated Islamic terrorist suicide bombings. A total of 359 people lost their lives in the attack, and several were left injured. Turning back time to the early 1980s, Sri Lanka was at the start of its civil war between the majority Sinhalese and minority Sri Lankan Tamils. It was also during this time that Manivannan's family, who were among the Tamil diaspora, left Sri Lanka. The civil war ended in 2009. However, Manivannan would only return in 2019 to face the tragedy of the Easter bombings. The Mothers is a poem based on the Mothers of the Disappeared and the Easter Sunday bombings. Mothers of the Disappeared is a movement in Sri Lanka that followed after the years of civil war. It was formed by women who wanted to know what happened to their abducted children. The figures range from 30,000 to 60,000 men and women who've been missing since the 80s. I'd like to read a passage from an article that has been following this movement, just for us to really understand the gravity of this situation. I am the luckiest mother in Sri Lanka. I got my son's body back. There are thousands of mothers who never get their children's bodies back. Dr. Manorani Saravanamuthu was speaking after the inquest of her son, journalist and writer Richard de Souza, whose tortured body had washed up on a beach in Maratua in February 1990. Richard was dragged from home by armed men in the middle of the night. Dr. Saravanamuthu's experience is one the speaker represents in the poem. She and other mothers of the disappeared had to give up the only photographs they had of their beloved. They had to conjure up faith in the prayers done on their behalf, and had to appeal to a world that didn't care to learn their names or even the names of their dead. The speaker delineates these tragedies so painfully well that you can really imagine each scenario. One mother on her knees in prayer, having propped up her only image of her child among the religious paraphernalia like a shrine. Or imagine these astounding lines. A mother whose own countenance howls in frames the world scrolls past. Just imagine her face as she gets increasingly anguished by the state of her situation. Her frustration and sadness fuse to express the loss of her beloved and the indifference of the world around her. The stanzas ascribed to the Easter Sunday bombings detail the various tragedies that took place on that day. Wholly, we can just take it to have been a terrorist attack, but the speaker adds the finer distinctions that allow for a more meaningful reflection. As aforementioned, 3 churches and 3 hotels were bombed. The speaker dedicates each stanza to illustrate a scene. In the first stanza, we are presented with a mother in a church with her young child. A mundane scene on the surface. It seems like it was just another Sunday in church. The second and third stanzas discuss the mothers of the disappeared, which we've just gone over. The fourth stanza is set at the morgue, where a mother who is only known as Amma, which means mother, is identifying her beloved by looking at wedding rings and blood-stained shoes. The fifth stanza is set in a hotel. A mother is with her hangry children in a line for a buffet. she stands in between them to prevent a fight, whilst wishing they had gone for a swim instead. This is such a congenial and innocent scene. The 6th stanza was elusive at first. I wondered, what did a mother with a baby keeping time inside her body, a mother with a bomb, mean? Well, this stanza was referring to one of the explosions that didn't happen in a church or hotel. When authorities arrived at the home of one of the suicide bombers, it was discovered that his pregnant wife blew herself and other children up. A mother with a baby keeping time inside her body. A mother with a bomb. The 7th stanza and ending couplet are probably the most crushing for me because this misfortune is made all the more apparent. A mother is in the kitchen, measuring sugar, generously at that, for the feast her children will relish when they get home from church. As she is partaking in this labor of love, it is supposed that the children are just about to say grace in Sunday school and probably make their way home, where their mother eagerly waits to celebrate with them. Alas, they never made it home, or even at the church. The mothers really brings out the plight of women in developing nations. I don't mean that developing nations are all ridden with conflict, but I hope this brings the feminist politics of location to mind. In a very subtle way, this piece honors femininity and motherhood, which appear to be estranged from feminism as we know it today. Now that we, through this poem, have stepped out of Western feminist discourse, how about we head over to the mother of mankind to explore African feminism? Now that we, through this poem, have stepped out of Western feminist discourse, how about we head over to the mother of mankind to explore African feminism?